Welcome back to the book club. Today, what I'm going to be talking about is a book review for Steven Erikson's book, Gardens of the Moon. This is book one of the Malazan Book of the Fallen. I've made a couple of videos about this book so far on my YouTube channel. I was reading it originally sort of book club style and honestly got a little bit too sucked into the book and wasn't able to dedicate the time to actually create those videos and instead just continued reading the book. So what I'm going to do instead is make this book review video, which is going to be spoiler free and just talking about high level what I thought about the book. And then a follow-up video, which is more in depth and talking about spoilery stuff, more specific information about what I thought about specific characters or plots, all of that. So for this book review, there's three main aspects that I'm going to be talking about. The first one is the plot slash world building. The second is characters. And the third is the pacing of the book. And then there's a last category, which is whether or not I will keep reading this series. So for the plot of Gardens of the Moon, I rated this a 9 out of 10. I think that the only real point I can take away was, at least as far as I understand it currently, the climax had a bit of like a Deus Ex Machina situation where I don't fully understand something that happened. And I'm hopeful that in further books, there's 9 more books in the series, and there's like a bunch of other related books in this universe. I have to imagine that in at least some of them, these details are fleshed out more so that like the ending of this book makes a little bit more sense. But in terms of just within this book alone, there was a part of the climax that sort of just a thing happened that came out of nowhere and kind of saved the day, which I thought was like a little bit weird, but also interesting. I think that the book is very close to getting a 10 out of 10 with in terms of the plot. I think that the world building is absolutely insane. It's one of the things that people talk about with regard to the Malazan Book of the Fallen series in general, how like crazy deep the world building is. I believe that the author is an archaeologist and an anthropologist. Before he became a writer, or maybe he still is doing both of those things. But I think that that shows a lot in this book. You can really tell that there's a very, very, very lived in world that has so many different locations and races of people and like clans and all this stuff that it's quite honestly very confusing. It's again, it's something that people talk about with the Malazan series. They talk about how confusing it is to get into and how you're just sort of thrown into the world. I can attest to that. That is true. It took me a while to get through like the first half of this book as I was wrapping my head around various names. But that also like lends itself to, once you get past that hump and you get over the learning curve of figuring out how to read and understand this book, and how sometimes you just have to ignore something until it's explained later. You really start to get a feel for how deep and crazy this world is. It's very impressive how in a lot of fantasy books, there's like a couple towns and maybe like a valley in between them. In this book, there's like 13 different plains that exist between 2 towns. And you kind of have to like look at a map to understand where characters are. Are they on the Rivi Plain? Or which direction is that, west or east of Darujistan? Where's the lake in relation to Darujistan? Where's Pale in relation to all of this? How many plains do they have to cross to get from point A to point B? So I guess that's also maybe a word of warning, which is that if you're not into world building that's that deep and you don't want to have to ever look at the map that's in the front of the book, most fantasy books have a map that looks something like this. And most of the time, this map doesn't matter at all. But I think that in understanding this book, this map actually matters a lot. Knowing like where Lake Azure is, for example, and where the Gedrobi Hills are and all this stuff. It is fairly relevant in terms of understanding the plot, because all the characters are in different locations and you hop between characters. So it can be a bit tricky to follow along. That all being said, I think that this book had a pretty awesome climax. I think that Steven Erikson's able to write battle scenes very well, or climactic events really well. I felt like over the course of the book, the various plot lines developed in satisfying ways, and there's not really any there are a bunch of conclusions, but like there's also so many more questions that you have at the end of the book, which makes sense because there's 9 more books in the series. So I assume that we're going to be seeing, very many of these characters again, and we're going to be learning more about them. And the events of this book are probably going to be relevant in the future books of this series. Now, moving on to characters, I would rate the characters a 7 out of 10. And the reason for this is I think that a handful of characters are 10 out of 10s. And then there's just a bunch of kind of weak side characters that do take up a lot of space in the book, but I feel like don't really do that much. And maybe I just like need to reread it and I'll get a better feel for those characters. But I felt like in general, just to avoid like any spoilers, there's a group of characters from the city of Darujistan. There's a group of characters that are Malazan. I think that the Malazan crew is extremely fleshed out. I think that characters like Whiskey Jack are very cool. I want to know more about him and his crew and all of that. I think that they have like some satisfying events that happen over the course of the plot, which kept me interested in their stories. The characters in Darujistan, I think, painted a good, it was an important role because you needed to know what was happening in that city from the inside in order to understand the plot of the book. But I felt like many of the characters didn't really develop in any way, or they were just kind of like, they were just weaker. I'll talk more about it in my more in-depth video. Sorry, while my dog's chasing my cat around my room. I'll talk more about that in my spoiler video, but I felt like just some of the Darujistan characters were a little bit weaker, which brings down my overall character rating a bit. And finally, for pacing, I would give this an 8 out of 10. I think this is maybe a controversial opinion, just because I've seen so much online discussion talking about how hard it is to follow this book and how hard it is to read because you're just kind of thrown into this world. I think that the actual pacing of the book, like if you look at it chapter by chapter, there is a lot of new mysteries added and mysteries solved in each chapter. Like I remember early on in the book, by chapter 2 or 3, you learn more information about the prologue and you can go back and be like, oh, cool. Like these events now make sense. And that I think helps the pacing a lot, even if there's not really a ton happening in some of the middle chapters. And it's more just like plot development and like subtle, characters moving around and figuring out each other's motives and all that stuff. I think that there's like this unlocking of mysteries of things that happened a couple chapters earlier, which keeps happening throughout the book, which actually makes the pacing pretty good. And the main reason I'm taking away 2 points is just because of how confusing it can be. Again, if you're not like looking at a map and seeing where different locations are, it can be really hard to know. Like, I think that the Rivi Plain or something like that, I don't know how to say any of these locations, is a place that they're at in the book. And I'm like, okay, well, character A is there and character B is on some other plane. And is that near where they are? Like, are they going to walk into each other at some point, or are they walking in opposite directions? It's not really clear at all unless you consult the map, because there's like so many different forests and lakes and valleys and all this stuff in between the couple cities that this book takes place in. Really, like the book takes place in a very small area, but the characters go so many different ways from point A to point B that it's a bit confusing. So I guess despite the fact that it is so confusing, I think that if you're okay with that, or if you can get over that hump, then the pacing is actually very solid. And as you go along, like I think I hit halfway through the book, and then all of a sudden I was like, I can't stop reading this. I need to keep seeing what happens. The first half of the book takes up a lot of I have no idea what the hell a Teist Andy is, and I don't know if this is like a race of people or some tribe, or like are these humans or non-humans or whatever. A lot of those questions get answered later in the book, and then once you get to a point where you at least have some sort of baseline understanding of the universe, then you are adding less concepts every chapter, so every chapter becomes easier to read, and you just sort of like steamroll through them. So I think that overall, if you give this book it's fair due, and understand that it might take a little bit to learn what's going on in the beginning, and it may take some time to piece together what the author is saying, and also have an understanding that you'll get a word thrown at you. You'll have no idea what it means. there will be no context for it. And that's kind of okay, because in a couple chapters, a character is going to have some conversation or be thinking about it. And then it's going to reveal more information about that. There's like a couple races of people that were mentioned in this book in very offhand ways, and I had no idea what the words meant until later on when they described more people using the same name. And then I realized, oh, this is like a giant race of people or very tall race of people or whatever. I remember the Moranth is mentioned multiple times in this book, and there's some like insectoid but still humid type tribe. And the first few times they're mentioned, there's nothing said about them at all besides the fact that there's black Moranth and gold Moranth and whatever. And then, 2 or 3 chapters later, there's finally this explanation about, oh, well, the Moranth are sort of like A, B, and C. And there's still a lot of mysteries about them, but you sort of learn about where they live and how they travel and what the tribes do and how they interact and all that stuff. So overall, the last category here is, will I keep reading the series? And the answer to this is definitely yes. I am actually already about halfway through book 2 of this series, Dead House Gates. And I'm debating whether or not I want to make a, halfway through book discussion for that book, just because it's like 800 something pages. It's pretty dense. Again, there's a lot of information thrown at you and you're in a totally different region. So I do plan on continuing to read this series. I'll probably do what I did after this book and take a break in between each book of the novel and maybe read a couple other books in between. But I'm very interested in the continuation of the Malazan world. I think that whatever's going on here is very interesting. I think there's a billion questions I still have about Gardens of the Moon that I think, or I hope, will be answered in the future 9 books somewhere. I know, for example, there's like a mention of a crippled god or a chained god or something, and that's like the name of the last book in the series. So I saw that in the book and it was like, ooh, that's the name of one of the books in the series. Like, I'm curious. I guess we're gonna find out more about whoever this like crippled god is. That's gonna be relevant in some way because it's in the last book. So there's like a lot of little nuggets like that just thrown throughout that make me excited and looking forward to reading more. And I think that also, or at least I'm hopeful that as I continue to read the books, there's less like startup time of figuring out what all the characters are and like what all the pieces of the world are. I think that was the hardest part about starting to read Gardens of the Moon, was just so much information is thrown at you that it's hard to understand. Even the beginning of book 2 is still a bit like that because it's in a desert and there's somehow a name of, there's 50 different locations that are within like a 50-mile radius in the desert, and they're all thrown at you. So I think that trend will continue, but I'm hoping that understanding these, like how magic works and the elder races and all of this stuff, this is now knowledge that I have. So it'll be easier to understand what happens in the future books. So let me know if you've read this book before. Let me know what you think. If you're thinking about reading this book, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to talk about it, and I'll see you next time.